we're installing Firestone's Ride-Rite kit on the Silverado, and along with that I got a Ridetech manual compressor kit. I don't have the parts out in front of me because I've already installed them on the truck. The Ride-Rite kit was pretty straightforward. The Firestone instructions have good detail and they work just fine, and so do the Ridetech instructions. It was a little more complicated when it came to the compressor install, as all you get is a diagram on how it's supposed to be set up. So I'll walk you through just quickly how easy it is to install the airbags on the truck, and then we'll get into a little bit more about the compressor system. So per the instructions, the unit gets pre-assembled on the bench, and once you've done that, the assembly just sits down inside the truck onto the axle and underneath the frame. You've taken off the original bump stops at this point. After you set it in place, the instructions tell you to bolt the upper two bolts into place up here into the old original bump stop locations, and then to attach it to the axle. Well, I have the bed off the truck and there's a little more space between the axle and the frame, so there was a good 2-inch gap there for me. So I installed the clamps on the lower bracket, which I'll show in a second, loosely first, and then pulled the upper bracket up against the frame. To attach the unit to the axle, you install the bail clamp around the U-bolts and then the axle strap clamp underneath the axle and tighten those down. Be careful though, they don't get tight like you would expect. They are lock nuts, but just tighten them down. If you go too far, you'll end up bending both the bail clamp and the axle strap. Once you have everything in place, you need to tighten the fastener that attaches the bag to the lower bracket, the bolt you installed on the bench, loosely down here, as it auto centers itself to line up with the frame. Now I have the bed off the truck for this installation, but that's not required. It'd be just as easy to do it with the bed on. But since I do have the bed off, I ran the airlines up above the fuel tank on the driver's side. And then the passenger side, you would be able to do the same with the bed on. I did attach the T to the frame rail right here to attach the driver and passenger side together. And then I ran the hose up to the bottom of the cab. This is the first time I've installed an air system like this, and the instructions that came with the compressor kit don't tell you how to get the airlines into the truck or where to install the control panel. I tried Googling some and looking, and it didn't really come up with any answers. It's probably, I probably just wasn't Googling very well. But so I figured out a way. It may not be the best. If there's better ways, please let me know in the comments. But I'll show you what I did. I didn't want to have to run the airlines all the way to the front and back in through the firewall somewhere, but I remembered under the door sill when I was doing the rockers recently that there's a pretty good gap in there. So I pulled it off, and sure enough, there's a good sized gap there, big enough to run the airlines through. So what I did is I came back here under this piece and I drilled a 9/16 hole, since I have to run 2 airlines, that goes down inside the rocker. I was able to feed that back out through the hole in the inner rocker and then bring it around and under the frame. For the hole on the inside, when I get the second line ran, I'll take RTV and I'll make sure that those lines can't rub on anything and seal the hole up. I then ran the line up the corner of the kick panel and underneath the dash, right under the glove box, there's a channel there that you can run the line, and ran it all the way over to where my brake controller is. As I mentioned before, there was no instructions on where to mount this, and I'm sure it's because it's different for every vehicle. A perfect place would have been right where my brake controller is, but I don't really have anywhere else to put the brake controller. And here, if I come up too high, ashtray, not that I use it, but would be blocked off. So what I did is I made a bracket, and that bracket mounts right under here and then relocates so that the control panel could stick out here. Another problem I had there was the air fittings off the back would hit the air box here if it wasn't brought out and down just a little bit. Something else the instructions don't tell you is where to mount the compressor. So in my truck, there's this extra tray right next to the fuel tank. I figured that would be a good spot to put it since it's not being used. Here's a shot from underneath. I just drilled 2 holes, mounted it with the hardware and the clamp that came with the kit. Ran the air line in the wire over to connect in with the air hose coming from the bags in the back. And then to show you how I routed it, I came around the body mount here, and that's where it enters the inner rocker. Now you can see the electrical tape there. I want to make sure that that's not going to rub through, so I pulled it out, wrapped about 3 layers of electrical tape, and then pulled it back in. Inside the truck, again, I'll show you where I came in through the floor. I filled that hole, underneath and all around it with RTV for 2 reasons. For one, I want to keep all the moisture out of the truck, and 2, to keep the lines from moving and being able to rub on anything. So as you can see, I got the second line and the wire in. I ran those up in that same channel and up into the kick panel and across the bottom of the dash over to the control panel. It might be a little bit hard to see, but you can see where the air lines come down the dash, and then I looped them around the pillar here and came around and connected it to the back of the control panel. I got my brake controller set down out of the way so I could show you. Stick it back up in place. To power the system, I ran the wires up under the dash and over to the fuse panel. I used this stud here as the ground, see the black wire, and I needed a 20 amp circuit, so I used an add fuse. There's only one 20 amp circuit in this box. It's for an auxiliary circuit, and that's where I tapped the power from. Something else the instructions don't tell you is that there's a light in the gauge. It doesn't tell you how to wire that. So if you want it to turn on and off with your headlights and dim with your headlights, you have to find a circuit in the dash that also does that. About 10 years ago, I installed gauges in this truck, so I already had that green wire is tapped up. You probably can't see it, but up in there, if you take the switch, the dash part, take the switch panel out, you can get to the wiring harness back there and tap into one of the circuits that control the lights. To wire the pump, I ran the wire back from the control panel, the power wire, and then the ground, I actually just ran it straight across here. There's a ground point on the forward bed mount. This is the wire that runs up to the filler neck. So I just tied the ground for the pump into that ground point. The kit came with the manual fill valves, and I figured it was a good idea to go ahead and add one of those valves into the circuit in case the compressor were to fail. So I actually got an extra T from Ridetech and some extra hose. I'll get into that in a little bit. And added in that manual valve just in case. The instructions say to use a 20 amp fuse between the compressor and the fuse box. It doesn't say whether it should be an all-time powered source or a keyed source. Mine happens to be powered all the time, so we'll see if it drains. The kit comes with this fuse holder, the large 20 amp blade fuse. This is a 10 gauge wire. The pump's running a 16 gauge wire, I think, and I used 14 gauge wire to wire everything. That's why I used my add fuse, which is a 14 gauge wire. This would have been too difficult to wire and it really doesn't make sense, so I didn't use it. Also, I went back to Ridetech and I said I got a T. Well, I also got more line. I ran out of line. The kit comes with 30 feet, and I ended up needing another 10 feet of hose to run back to the compressor. The instructions don't tell you where to mount the compressor. I'm assuming you want it back under the bed. It's too loud to have inside the cab, and I wouldn't want it under the hood because I feel like there would be too much heat. So now I've got an extra 20 foot of line. I feel like the kit probably should have came with about 40 foot of line rather than the 30 that it came with. But in summary, the kit was pretty easy to install once I figured out where the airlines needed to run, and I hope that this helps somebody figure out where to run their airlines. If you have any comments on how I could have ran the lines differently or installed anything differently, let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching.